Hi, good morning everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, particularly on a gorgeous Palmerston North day. Yeah, it's very nice. So yeah, I came from the Netherlands 23 odd years ago to marry a Southlander, so I feel Kiwi actually, I have to say. But and have been living in Dunedin ever since. So I've been working on greenhouse gases for a long time. I'm a soil scientist, and so my expertise is mainly in the nitrous oxide space and the farm system type space. The work I'm presenting here today on methane, I have to acknowledge my animal science colleagues here from Palmerston North in particular, where the Methane Research Centre is, who have provided input and advice on the slides and the information I'm presenting here today. So as Joe said, I'm talking about methane, nitrous oxide, give a bit of background where they come from and the research that's going on, and we'll go into what actually can we do now to minimize or reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural systems. So first of all, methane from ruminants. So as Nick already indicated, methane originates from the rumen of the animal and through enteric fermentation, which is basically the digestive process in the rumen. And fermentation the rumen is actually quite a unique thing, and in terms of it can ferment foods or protein that we actually as humans can't digest into something we can, which is milk and meat. And that's a pretty unique thing. And looking at it in a little bit more detail, so the masticated feed enters the rumen, and there's microbes in that rumen, bacteria, protozoa, fungi that will actually break down that feed, and they break it down into volatile fatty acids on one hand, which are the good guys, if you like. They are the compounds that provide the animal with the energy it needs to produce its milk and meat and grow. The other compounds that it produces in that process are hydrogen and carbon dioxide, and those two are being mopped up, if you like, by another group of microorganisms in the rumen. They're called the methanogens that produce the methane out of that hydrogen and carbon dioxide. That methane is then coming out by belching or a small amount at the back end. If those methanogens weren't mopping up that hydrogen in particular, that would actually have a negative feedback loop onto the digestive process. So in effect, they're doing actually a really good thing by taking the hydrogen away, but in the process producing the methane. And as I said, the volatile fatty acids, they are the good guys, the propionates, the butyrates, and the acetate. That is what the animal uses to grow and to provide energy for milk production and for maintenance as well. So if we move on to the mitigation options and the research that's been going on, I'll present 4 key areas of work that have been going on over the last few years, few decades almost already. And all that work is really coordinated and led out of the NZA GRC and the PGRC. They are the organizations that are driving, leading, funding, most particularly, this work. They are not, those organizations are not research organizations as such, so there's no a grouping of people sitting and doing the research. The research is actually done by our existing research organizations, the existing CRIs like AgResearch, Landcare, the universities. So these 2 bodies are coordinating, leading, and organizing the work. Does that make sense? So just coming back to your question before. So the first of the options that are here that scientists have identified is greenhouse gas, low greenhouse gas feeds or methane feeds. As Nick indicated before, most of the feed that an animal eats is determined, the methane emissions from that are determined by the amount of dry matter it takes in. So often methane is expressed as units per kilogram of dry matter intake. And for most feeds, and the scientist has screened many different types of feed, that doesn't change. So for most feeds, the amount of methane produced per kilogram of dry matter intake remains at about around 21, 22 grams of methane per. What the scientists have found, though, that is, for example, here for forage rape, there was a consistently lower methane yield. So on a dry matter intake basis, the methane emissions from that, forage rape were always lower. There is also some evidence that fodder beet may do the same thing, but there's still work ongoing to quantify and to verify that. Other feeds that have also shown low emissions is, for instance, high cereal diets, but you really need to feed the animal 80% or more in its dry matter as cereal, which is possibly fine in a TMR-based system, but in our New Zealand pasture-based system, that's very hard to achieve. And then two other ones that are also listed here are maize silage and tannin. Maize silage, the results from overseas have shown there is actually an effect of maize silage. That hasn't been able to be replicated in New Zealand. The studies done here have shown there's no difference in the methane yield. So per unit of dry matter intake, again, there was no difference between methane, between maize and ryegrass, for instance. And then those plants with tannins have also shown to be possibly reducing methane yields. But also a little bit inconsistent result. And the other side of that is as well with tannins, you have to be careful to get the balance right, because if you feed them too much tannins, it has a negative feedback loop on intake again. So those two are probably not focus of it at the moment to follow up on. But the forage rape and fodder beet are. The second area of work that has been shown, coming back to a question that was here this morning, I can't remember who it was, but about genetics. And yes, there is definitely evidence that, and it's a breeding value now for sheep, the scientists have shown there is a reduction, or there is a genetic relationship between methane, low and high methane sheep. So there are two lines of animals now that are being used for research. One are high emitters, one are low emitters. The low emitters, and it's shown that it's heritable, it's repeatable, so it's something that we can select for. And it's done in sheep. For now, numerous animals had to be screened to do that and to get to this point. And at the Methane Research Center, there are many respiration chambers that the animals are in, and that's where the measurements are done. And because the sheep are smaller, it's easier to do it on many sheep. And for cattle, there are a few. How many are there here? Four chambers for cattle versus 24, I think it is for sheep. So that's why we have made more progress with the sheep. Having said that, about 2 years ago, I think it is, a large screening program started with Dairy NZ, led by Dairy NZ, which is really at this point, first goal is to try and develop a robust and cost-effective method of screening large number of animals to actually get a cattle screening program going. So it's underway. So hopefully we'll find the same as we find for sheep, and that it is actually a heritable trait. And this is the results of that screening program that has been done. This is an example here, 4 studies, with the green being the high emitting line of a sheep and the blue being the low emitting line, and a consistent and repeatable effect of between 8 and 10% reduction in methane yield. And the evidence is suggesting that it's actually because the animals have a smaller rumen, so there's a faster throughput of the feed through the animal, which reduces its methane yield. So the other 2 parts of the research that is ongoing still is developing a methane inhibitor, so administering something to the animal that will actually impact on the methanogens, on the process in the rumen, and then inhibit the methane coming out. There are some good leads there. There was one product you may have heard about that was discovered in the Netherlands and Switzerland, I think it was a combination, and that is being trialed now here as well. And the scientists here have also identified potential compounds that could be used for that. The last one, the methane vaccine, that's a very, very challenging research area. A lot of work has been done, some good progress has been made, but there's still a lot of water to go under the bridge there. But if we are able to crack that nut, if we are able to find a vaccine that will inhibit methane, that will actually be a game changer for New Zealand, because it's something that can be administered quite easily to animals. Animals are already vaccinated, so it's the whole consumer perception is probably not as a greater risk compared to a compound you may feed it as an inhibitor. So that is definitely work that's still ongoing. It's very, very difficult science, but it's still worth pursuing because of the big potential impact it could have if we get there. So that was a short overview of methane. I'll go on to the nitrous oxide work now. And again, Nick showed you guys already the nitrogen cycle. Here it is again. For nitrous oxide, most of the emissions occur from the animal urine patches that are deposited during grazing. It's about 80% of total emissions from New Zealand and nitrous oxide come from those urine patches. Once that urine hits the ground, and the urea in that urine is hydrolyzed very rapidly into ammonium, and that can then be nitrified into nitrate and then denitrified into nitrous oxide emissions. And again, as Nick said, that denitrification, when nitrous oxide emissions occur, is particularly, the rates are particularly high when the soil is wet or compacted. And that is because the oxygen is basically pushed out of the soil. If there's low oxygen content in the soil, that's when nitrous oxide emissions are highest, because that's when denitrification occurs. And you can here also see the immediate link with nitrate leaching, because both nitrous oxide emissions and nitrate leaching have the same starting point of nitrate in the soil. So anything we do to try and minimize the amount of nitrate in the soil will have both a positive effect on reducing nitrate leaching and nitrous oxide emissions. So some of you may sometimes hear the term indirect nitrous oxide emissions, and this is just an example of one of them that's called an indirect emission. So that nitrate, once that's leached and is entering waterways, can then subsequently also be denitrified. So it could be kilometers down in a stream or in a lake or wherever it is, away from the farm. But it still contributes to nitrous oxide emissions. That's the term indirect emissions coming from. So what are some of the options? I've got a couple here that I will talk about. First of all, the ones that is also being looked at, particularly for reducing nitrate leaching losses, is the one where we trying to keep the animals off at times when we know emissions will be high. Again, which is when it's wet, when it's compacted, when there is not a huge amount of uptake because the plants are not growing as much as they would be over summer. So it's during the risky time of year, which is often winter, late autumn, winter time. So research has shown, measurements have been done in different areas in the country, different number of years, and that has shown that yes, during that period, if you keep the animals off, collect that urine and dung, apply it later on in spring when the plants can actually use it, nitrous oxide emissions will be lower. But there are also some unintended consequences, if you like. You have to be aware of that while that urine and dung or the effluent is in storage in the system, it could lead to increased methane emissions or other gaseous emissions. And yeah, we have to just be a bit more clear about what these emissions are, and work is on the way to quantify those. So there is a potential of pollution swapping, and it very much depends on the system that's being used, how long the storage is for, and how many animals you use, and all that. And also the last point I'll put up here is, if you put a lot of investment into buying or putting that infrastructure in, the logical thing to do is to try and recoup some of that investment. And we've seen some farmers then indeed increasing cow numbers because you have the opportunity to do that, and which is a real understandable thing to do, but it actually negates some of the benefits that you're actually trying to achieve by putting a ban in. The second area would like to touch on in terms of nitrous oxide emissions is some low nitrous oxide feed options that we have starting to look into. Here's some early results of work that's been done in the last couple of years, and its association with two other big research programs, the Pastoral 21 research program and the Foragers for Reduced Nitrate Leaching program. So because nitrous oxide and nitrate leaching are so closely related, we've always worked very closely together with the programs that are actually focusing on nitrate leaching, because it's silly to do your own thing and do things completely independently. It makes much more sense in terms of resource use to combine effort, and that's what we've done in these cases. So here's work that's results are showing that for comparing fodder beet with kale, for instance, as a winter crop, urine patches applied to the fodder beet crop had lower emissions than urine patches applied to a kale crop. Again, if there is also a methane benefit for fodder beet, that is, of course, a win-win, if you like. And work is still ongoing to confirm these results. The other one we've looked at is plantain. Probably you've heard a little bit about plantain recently. And yes, there is some evidence that it also has a benefit for nitrous oxide emissions. In this case, this trial here, we found on average, it was 4 different times it was measured. We found on average a 28% reduction of nitrous oxide from urine patches, the same type, the same amount of urine applied to either plantain or ryegrass. Everything else was the same, the plant species was different, and we found a 28% lower nitrous oxide emissions. So there's a few reasons why that could be. It could be either the plantain took up more water and thus dried out the soil more, so emissions are lower because you have a drier soil underneath. It could be that plantain, because of its morphology, would actually spread the urine more evenly or differently. Or it could be, and that's the hypothesis we think is probably the most likely, there are some exudates in the roots of plantain that are going into the soil that actually impact on the nitrogen cycle, and that it has a benefit there. So it's almost like a nitrification inhibitor. You all probably heard about the nitrification inhibitor DCD. Can't use it anymore. But this could actually be a biological way of achieving the same thing. And if we're investigating that, a lot of work funded by NZA GRC is going on at the moment, the next couple of years, to get clarity on that. So this is just a slide to highlight for us that we're very aware of. We can do all the research in small plot trials or in the lab, and we'll have some ideas about what could potentially work, and some may fall out on the bottom of that funnel. But then there's still a long way to go before it actually could be a farmer adoption that it's at the state you guys are comfortable to actually implement it on your farm. And there's a range of questions that we really need to answer in that process. And that's why it often takes a bit of time to get from A to B, and it's linear, but it's not linear. It should be more of an iterative process or a circle, or just a linear, because it's easier to depict that way. But you hopefully understand what I mean. We're very aware that we can come up with something, but it then actually needs to work on the farm. So that's certainly in the whole process of the program as well. All right, I'm coming into the last section of the presentation, which is looking at sort of system options. What are things that we actually can do now already? And I'm coming back to the first methane and nitrous oxide, so the two together now. Same cow. Spot the difference? Anybody? You like my photoshopping? Yeah, I made it suddenly urinate. Anyway, there's the same cow, but focusing on methane and nitrous oxide. So what we're saying here for the methane mitigation at the moment, really the focus is on managing dry matter intake. Because dry matter intake is directly related to your methane emissions, by managing, or probably more specifically reducing the intake of the total herd, you will reduce your methane emissions. For nitrous oxide, we're talking very much about manage for nitrogen surplus. So all the good things everybody is doing to minimize nitrate leaching losses will more than likely also have a positive effect on nitrous oxide emissions, i.e. reducing them. If we manage or reduce dry matter intake, that will also mean that we're reducing the intake of nitrogen into the animals, which will reduce the amount of urine coming, or nitrogen coming back in the urine, which will also have a positive effect on managing your nitrogen surplus. So those are sort of the key messages for now to focus on. And in terms of managing dry matter intake, there's obviously, if you reduce the dry matter intake of the animal, it will have an effect on your productivity. But if you then look at, well, can I increase my per cow performance by having fewer animals that produce more, you can maintain your milk solids production, but the intake requirements will be lower because you don't need as much energy for maintenance. So that's the example that's being used. And by doing that, by having a higher per cow performance at a lower stocking rate, you can achieve that perhaps by looking at increasing the genetic merit of the animals, or looking at animal health. If you have healthier animals, they don't need to spend their energy on keeping themselves fit. They can use the energy for producing milk. Or improving reproduction will also help. Another recent study was looking at once-a-day milking, and some of the modeling is suggesting that that will indeed reduce intake and greenhouse gases from the farm, but provided the stocking rate is the same. So I hear that sometimes when you transition into once-a-day milking, farmers tend to up the stocking rate. So you can select for the ones that are actually able to do the once-a-day, but that will take some of the benefits away again. Reducing replacement rate, again, is about reducing the dry matter intake required for non-productive, non-milk producing side of the herd. Improving pasture quality, I'll come back to in a minute. And then the other side of the coin is also to look at, can we actually change some of our pastoral land into forestry, for instance, or any other land use that doesn't produce feed for the animals, because then overall, for the farm, there's lower dry matter production and dry matter intake, lower emissions. So let's have a look at that, actually. How does that work? So the dry matter that the animal eats is really to provide her with the energy she requires to produce the milk. So the energy requirement is to produce the milk. The amount of feed it then takes in is dependent on the ME content, or the energy content of the feed. Yeah? Make sense? So you have the dry matter intake, and then we know that there's a methane yield that is attached to that. That provides you with the methane production of the assessment of the methane production of that herd. So what if we had better quality feed, so there's more ME content in your feed? The requirement for the animal remains the same, but because the ME content is higher, to get the same amount of energy, you have the opportunity to reduce your dry matter intake. And that would then result into a reduction in methane emissions. Of course, if you have a higher ME content feed, but you don't reduce your dry matter intake, you will produce more milk, which is good too, but you won't reduce your methane emissions. Okay? So another example is, what if we had a low methane feed? For example, here, forage rape. So there's, again, no change in what the animal actually, the ME requirements for the herd are. There's also no change in dry matter intake, and I've assumed here that the ME content of that feed is the same. But as I showed you before, forage rape can reduce the methane yield. And the extent to which it reduces the methane yield obviously depends on the proportion of rape in the diet. So this is just a theoretical example. Say that on average the methane yield drops down by 5%. That means your methane emissions go down by 5%. And the last example I have here is, okay, what can we do to reduce the overall energy requirements of the herd? Example being that I said before, maintaining milk solids, but get those milk solids from fewer animals, fewer higher producing animals. You reduce your ME requirements because there's less maintenance energy required. So an example here, if that would reduce ME requirement by 10%, gives you the option again to reduce your dry matter intake by 10%, which reduces methane. Key message out of this is that it's the amount of feed that's going through the herd that is the most determining factor for methane emissions. So if you want to reduce overall absolute emissions of methane, the best thing to do is try to manage the farm so that you reduce your inputs into the farm and reduce the amount of dry matter produced. So that's looking at managing your nitrogen fertilizer inputs or managing board-in feed that goes into the animal. So this slide is an example, again, of some of the work that we've been doing together with the Pastoral 21 program. P21 was looking at coming up with farm systems that would reduce nitrate leaching losses while maintaining productivity. And there were, in this case, this example, we have 3 regions in the country. Each color here is a different region. And each of those regions had a, what they termed a current system, so what's happening now, and an optimized system. So people sat around the table and decided, well, what are the things for this specific region that would work well to reduce our nitrate leaching losses? And I'll come to that in a minute. But and we tagged on with that work and utilized all the information that came out of that program to actually do a greenhouse gas footprint assessment. And what we found is that the thing that determines total greenhouse gas emissions most was the total amount of feed eaten. And that really is coming back to the story or the things I said before. And obviously, the total amount of feed eaten in the different regions, the differences between the regions is partly due to soil and climate differences. Some regions are just hotter and warmer and can produce more, partly due to differences in fertilizer inputs or imported feed. The change between the current systems, the open symbols are all the current system, the closed symbols are the future systems, if you like. That is very much due to a reduction in fertilizer inputs, a reduction in imported feed, and more importantly also associated with that, or as a consequence of that, a reduction in stocking rate. So each of those had a lower stocking rate, between 10 to 30% reduction in stocking rate, but also a reduction in the inputs that created dry matter for those animals. And the results were, the greenhouse gas results were really that it was between a 4 and 18% reduction in total emissions for the same milk solid production. These were farmlet systems in an experimental setup. In one example we know in the country, the Lincoln University Dairy Farm, for instance, they have shown that it is possible to do that on a commercial sized farm. Okay, I think it's one of my last slides. The reducing replacement rate is also an option that I talked about before, and this is just some results showing that some modeling and farmlet trials have been done, showing that if you can reduce your replacement rate in this instance to about 18% from about 22%, that would give you a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as well. In terms of managing nitrogen, the nitrogen surplus, as I said before, it's very much about doing the right things to reduce nitrate leaching as well. So reducing intake for the animal, use the lower end feed, reduce overall intake, which, as I said before, will have a co-benefit of reducing methane emissions, optimizing your fertilizer and effluent use so you actually can get more out of it. And the standoff and housing system, we have a question mark around here still, because there are some situations where it may actually not have an overall benefit for greenhouse gases. So last slide is really giving you a summary of the mitigation options that we think could be or are available now. So on the right here, those are the ones that we know are available that you can do. On the middle one is work that is ongoing that we think in the next 2 to 5 years may be ready to be implemented or adopted. And then here are some of the options that are being looked at. That will take a little bit longer before they will be available. Methane inhibitors, vaccines, as I said before, the selection of cattle or cows that are low greenhouse gases. We talked about pastures and pasture mixes with low GHG traits. Someone was talking about gene editing in pastures before, and obviously you may know about the work that's going on about high ME feed. And that will sit in that category there as well. And looking at alternative nitrification inhibitor, there's also a program of work going on trying to identify new compounds or different compounds that could lead to nitrification inhibition. Okay, thank you.